Thank you, Pravin, and it's a delight to be with everyone today, and I'm going to be talking about storytelling and how we can use that in the context of presenting market research results. Now, I must stress that what I'm talking about today is the traditional market research debrief, the 30, 45 minutes, 60 minutes to present the findings from a study. There are other ways of debriefing results. There are workshop sessions, encounter sessions, and all sorts of varieties. Those are different. So what I'm focusing on today is putting more engagement and more stickiness, to use a phrase that will come up on the very last slide of this presentation, into a conventional market research presentation. The most important thing to remember about storytelling is that we don't do it on our own. We do it with the audience. It's a co-creational process. You may tell the same story many, many times in many different places, but every time you tell it, it should be new because it should work with the people in the room, the crowd, the audience. So instead of thinking about, I am going to perform this story, it's that we are going to co-create this story. Of course, you as the presenter are going to take the lead, but there's far more to it than that. And I first became really interested in storytelling when I saw a presentation by Fred John, and I've done some workshops with him. Fred John's based in the US, works for MasterCard, and he runs workshops for SMR. And he looked at the traditional structure of a market research debrief, and it really shows our heritage in the scientific method. We have the introduction, the objectives and the method. Then we have the detailed findings, and these go to the conclusions and these go to the recommendations. A typical path might be to present that in questionnaire order, and a client always knows this is a red flag. If you see an agency present the results in questionnaire order, you know they've done very little thinking, very little analysis, and nothing to make the process more engaging. Other times you'll see that it's brought together in terms of the demographics. Here is who we spoke to. Here are the behaviors. People did this, this, this. The attitudes were that, and the reactions to the stimuli were as follows. This is all very logical, but the connections between the pieces are very weak. There's very little flow in that. Surely we can do better. And I would like to encourage us the paradigm really for storytelling back to the 19th century in the UK, what were sometimes called the penny thrillers. They were also called the penny dreadfuls. And these were stories that went out typically at 1 penny per section. Every bit had to be really exciting, otherwise people would not pay their penny and then want to read the next installment and the next installment and the next installment. So I think we need to think about presentations as storytelling in the context of these penny thrillers. Now, where does that take the paradigm? Well, first of all, it has to be massively engaging. We think back to the penny thrillers, they went bust if they weren't able to get people to finish the page, desperately wanting the next page. Every page in a market research penny thriller needs to tell a single story, and I'm going to come back to that point. Every page needs to lead to the next page. People have got to want your story next. If you think back to the penny thriller, it wasn't a collection of short stories where people might buy one story from one author and then another story from the next. It was a series. It led somewhere. So the story has a beginning, a middle and an end in a very traditional way. It shouldn't be either too clever, too deep, too philosophical. If you've got a room full of senior executives to 30 to 40 minutes, there isn't time to convey information, to convey recommendations, and to challenge their assumptions about the world, usually, and certainly not at the surface level. But this model has been used and can be used for more than just surface level thinking. Charles Dickens published most of his books in this penny thriller mode. So at one level, they were page-turning, rip-roaring stories that people wanted to read, but they were also a forensic diagnosis of what was wrong with Victorian society, the impact on the laws, the impact on imprisoning families when people are in debtors' prisons, the impact of poverty on morality. He was able to look at all of those by using this methodology. So superficially, it's going to be engaging and it's going to be straightforward, but it can have deeper levels to it. The most important thing about any presentation, and a storytelling presentation in particular, is narrative theme. Does it flow from one place to another? Is it not like a shaggy dog story which just goes all over the place, but actually builds on a purpose, draws the audience in? Narrative theme is actually really important when you write a proposal. It's really important when you create a questionnaire, but it's massively important when you are generating the story that is going to tell the results. And this storytelling takes part really in two parts of the same coin, or something that makes the complete circle. Every slide has to be part of the storytelling. And that makes us wonder about slides like, here were the demographics, here was the methodology. Do they really fit the story? And then the whole thing has to be a story. One of the most important tools you will ever use in storytelling your presentation is a storyboard. And when you download the slides, you can copy this, or you can make one very simply yourself and print it out and really try to use 9 squares to sketch out what is the story of your presentation. And it doesn't matter whether you've got a 20-minute presentation or a 2-hour presentation. At the storyboard level, you should be able to get it down to 9 storyboards, 9 pictures within that. This is what my message is going to be. Now, there are lots of different structures we can use within our storytelling. For example, sometimes people say, well, I can't really use storytelling because I'm doing a concept test and the client expects a management summary at the beginning that tells what the results are. Surely that's given the end away. That ruins the story. Well, think about Titanic. Did you really think that this time the boat would make it all the way? I don't think so. Chariots of Fire, we knew that those 2 protagonists got gold medals, but it still made a great story. So knowing the end does not rule out the story, because you still want to embed it with excitement. On the other hand, if you've got something like a segmentation study, it can be more like an Agatha Christie model. What is the motivation behind those? What could they have done, and who was the murderer? If we're thinking strategy, we very often go to nursery rhymes and folk tales. So the 3 bears, not too hot, not too cold, but just like Mummy Bear in the middle. If we're talking about a U&A, it's sometimes useful to use stories like The Monks and the Elephant, where the monks were all blinded by the head monk and they were sent to investigate the elephant, and one came back and said it's hard and made of ivory. Another one came back having felt the ear and said that it's a large flat object. Somebody else was feeling the trunk and they came back and say it's like a snake but longer and more powerful. And that helps us explain how different bits of the picture can create a misleading of the whole thing. Or we can take a TV show. The EastEnders is a TV show in the UK. We're doing a market study, and maybe we will make all of the brands in the study like some of the characters from EastEnders. Fred John, who I mentioned earlier, did a study about finance and wallet, and he set it in Midsummer Night's Dream, or Midsummer Night's Wallet, he called it, from Shakespeare. So we can take these and we can make them as elaborate, or we can make them as straightforward as is appropriate for the story and as is appropriate for the audience. Seth Godin, who is a management guru and quite often very wise, sometimes completely crazy, has a view that every slide should tell a single story. And I'm going to show you an exception in a moment to that sort of rule, but it's a very good rule for most of the time. And here is an example of one of his slides that shows a story. It's talking about the death rate per watts produced. Very small number for nuclear, bigger for oil, massive for coal. That's his story. Now, actually, I would probably change his data, challenge his data, not change it. But that's a separate issue. Once he's found his story, he's going to tell it on this slide in a very simple, straightforward, single way. Now, this brings us to an interesting kerfuffle, as we would say in the UK, between Tufte and people like Nigel Holmes. Tufte runs a campaign, Edward Tufte, about chart junk, and he thinks that the data should be presented very simply and straightforwardly, like it is at the bottom of this page. Nigel Holmes illustrates for things like Time magazine, and he creates slides that are a story that carry a message. And after Tufte ridiculed this method of presenting data, some side-by-side studies were run, and what they found was that the comprehension of the top chart and the bottom chart are very similar. but the recall of the top chart is much higher. And that's a really key point about storytelling. What we're trying to do is not only make it easier to understand the study, but we are trying to make it much more memorable so that it makes sense and that it sticks in people's minds. Now, here's another way of telling a story. This one comes from a book by Chip and Dan Heath called Made to Stick. And a guy called Art Silverman needed to get the message across that a bucket of popcorn at the theatre and the cinema contained 37 grams of fat, and this was really a health issue. So he looked at different ways of doing it, and he brought the media in, and he put out on a table a big fried up breakfast, a Big Mac and a steak, and pointed out that they have about the same amount of fat, so you can eat all of the stuff at the bottom or one big box of popcorn. And that told a story in a very straightforward and graphical way. But there are some other ways of going about it. One of the really fashionable things at the moment are infographics. And this is one from McCandless, which looks at the billion-dollar gram, where the BBC's money is all going. And if I were to use something like this in a presentation, I would probably stay on this slide for 15 or 20 minutes. And I would zoom in on the big grey square at the top left, because that's BBC One, and I would talk into that, and then I would zoom back to this slide. Then I might zoom into BBC Two and say, right, a lot fewer viewers, but actually look how similar the total amount of expenditure is. Are we spending more on the privileged people, etc.? Pull back out. Start looking at some of the other boxes. So infographics, which are packed full of information, are great in books, they're great in reports, but if you're going to use them in a presentation, you have to make a story out of that slide. And that story is going to need to have narrative flow, it's going to need to have analogies and similes, to really engage people and make it memorable. And then they can take that single document away, and that becomes a really useful infographic. So during the presentation, we may see 8 or 9 different versions of it, blowing up, looking into different sections, but at the end, it becomes a sustainable whole. Metaphor, analogy, and similes are the stock in trade of storytelling in markets and presenting information. So think about what Hollywood did. So when they're great at the concept pitch. So when they were trying to sell the idea of Alien, the film, they said Jaws in space. When they were pitching in business, somebody came up with flicker for videos as an idea of describing YouTube. When we're talking in terms of marketing studies and the rest of it, is the product like IBM? Is the product like Singapore Airlines? Is the product like Spam? Now, I might there be talking about Spam, the really grey, boring food, or the nuisance product that comes through our emails. But all the time, we're trying to bring the brands alive. One of the things that's very interesting is that in some markets, there is no truly excellent brand. So by making people realise that there is no Waitrose, as we would say in the UK, there is no Singapore Airlines in this market, helps them understand that the question is not how just to beat other people, but how to become a genuine number one. One of the two other things that we do in market research presentations that kill the story are the way we start them. We usually shuffle it up and say, right, okay, and then start doing some methodology, and the way we finish them. Think about good stories. The first lines tell you the whole context, and the last lines too. So here are just 3 first lines. To the red country and part of the grey country of Oklahoma, the last rains came gently, and they did not cut the scarred earth. So this was the story of the Dust Bowls and the Okies having to flee from Oklahoma, and the devastation caused and the poverty caused by 1, the lack of rain, and 2, the damage to the earth. The second one, it was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. So this is 1984 by George Orwell, set in the future. You can tell it's the future. You can tell that it's a dystopian, cold and grey future. And this is probably the most famous of the opening lines at the bottom. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Pride and Prejudice. These opening lines set the context. Our opening lines, our first slide, need to set the right context. So please keep that methodology, sample and design well away from the opening lines. And then think about how we're going to finish it. And here are 3 closing lines. The creatures outside looked from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again. But already it was impossible to say which was which. The end of Animal Farm, you can see the loss of all their dreams. But in spite of these deficiencies, the wishes, the hopes, the confidence, the predictions of the small band of true friends who witnessed the ceremony were fully answered in the perfect happiness of the union. Okay, it's a bit soft and slushy, but it rounds out the final picture. And most sinister of all, he loved Big Brother. The man was broken. The most important part about that 1984 story is that he rebelled and he failed and he was broken. And that is summed up so nicely in the last line there. There are alternatives to telling a penny dreadful or a penny thriller as your presentation. Recherche de temps perdu, apologies for my French accent there, In Search of Time Lost by Proust, 7 volumes, an enormous exercise, yet sometimes you do want to produce a large amount of data, but it's not going to be a story in our conventional sense. It's not going to be a debrief. Make sure that your debrief never becomes like a Proust novel. Waiting for Godot. The audience are left with lots of missing questions and answers. This is a great analogy for a workshop presentation or an encounter debrief where the client is expected to find the answers for themselves, or sometimes to discover that there aren't always answers. Both of these are great methods of doing debriefs, but they're not the bread and butter. The bread and butter is the standard debrief, which we can take, we can turn it into a narrative theme, create a story, and engage. 2 very strong recommendations. These 2 books were both written by Chip and Dan Heath. Made to Stick, why some ideas stay in people's minds and why others don't. And Switch, how to change things. Now, you can take from Switch the message about how to change things, but you can also take the way they describe things. Chip and Dan Heath have a wonderful way of turning things into stories, and that's what I would like to recommend to everybody. So with that, I'll say thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.